All right, so we're going to talk about the three characteristics of each government. We're going to define the systems of government based on who can participate. Then we're going to identify different ways the power can be distributed geographically and within a state, and then the government distribution of power between the branches. So, very simply put, guys, we're going to be adding some stuff to this. So we're going to be either, you need to have your notebook out as well, is what I'm getting at, because we're going to fill out this paper, but we're also going to write notes down to make this make sense. So you can either put it in your notebook or you can flip this paper over and write it on it. Either way, I don't care, as long as you know where you put them. Okay? So, let's start with a couple of definitions. Now, the way your definitions are sought out, it basically gives you the definition on the paper, and then we just match them. But before we do that, I want us to actually write them down. I know that sounds like a monotonous thing to do, but I feel like if you write it down, you know it. You understand what I'm saying? Like, we can match stuff all day, and that'd be great, but then at the end of the day, you may not have a clue what it means, okay? So either on the back or on another sheet of paper, whichever one you want to do it with, we're going to jot these down. Now, the first two, where you have autocracy and oligarchy, you've already done that, okay? We've already put that in your section 1 note, so you don't have to do that again. But I would like for you to flip back over to the front and look at this chart you have, where it's comparing a democracy with a dictatorship. Now, I told you guys the last time we were together that an autocracy and an oligarchy are both what? Which one of those are they? Are they a democracy or a dictatorship? Y'all remember? Take a guess. Does it sound like forms of democracy, or does it sound like forms of a dictatorship?
Dictatorship.
It sounds like forms of dictatorship. So, above where you have the word dictatorship right there in that box, write down those two words, autocracy and then write the word oligarchy. All right? Now, guys, I'm giving you a big hint there. Those two are both considered what type of government? A dictatorship. Y'all with me? Mm-hmm. Now, let's answer that within the box. All right? So it's asking you, sovereign power is held by blank. So what it is asking us here is, who has the power when it comes to a dictatorship? Well, it's got to be one of these two names, right? So beside the number 2, and if you want to rewrite it, that's fine, but I draw a little arrow from autocracy down and then write one person in number 2. Because if you look at your book definition, autocracy means it's a government in which a single person holds all the power. So an autocracy is one person. Y'all with me? So in a box beside the number 2, write down one person. Or a dictatorship can also be an oligarchy, where it says it's a government in which a small, usually self-appointed group has the role of sole power to rule. So beside a one person, I'd also put or small group. Is everybody with me? Does that make sense? So in the box, we should have the word autocracy, which means one person, and oligarchy, which means a small group. That's who has power within a dictatorship. So far, so simple. Any confusion? We good there? All right. The next couple, however, there's not any word. They've already been put at the bottom of your paper, but I want us to do something first. Okay. So on the back of your paper, here's how I would like for you to set this up. At the top of it, write down the word democracy. And then, move over a little bit and write down the word dictatorship. And I'll write this on the board for you.
Like 2 sections, like you split.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, on the back of your paper, like at the top of it, write down the word democracy. Don't split it, because if you split it in half, it ain't gonna work out the same. And then over here somewhere, write down the word dictatorship.
Okay.
Y'all with me? Once you do that, come on down a little bit, like halfway. Then we're gonna write out three other things. Unitary. And in the middle, we're going to write the word federal. And then on the far side, we're going to write the word confederate. And again, leave room under them, because we're going to add stuff to it. All right? And then toward the bottom, we're going to write down presidential. And then on the other side, parliamentary. Okay? Okay, does everybody see how we did that? Simple enough? All right. Between the words democracy and dictatorship, what are we going to put there, Coach?
Direct.
No. Not that part yet. Is it the how? Okay, that box. Who? All right. In between them, put down who has the power in parentheses. All right. Basically, who's in charge? That's what the democracy and the dictatorship is asking us. All right. In the middle there, between unitary, I got to write all these down real fast. Unitary, federal, and confederate. We're going to put how power is divided above those. How power is divided. And the reason, guys, we're putting these here, if you can remember these little sayings, when you see a question about them on a test or quiz, you eliminate some of them by just knowing this. If I ask you, how is power divided in blank? You're going to know that it's got to be dealing with a unitary, a federal, or a confederate type of government. Does that make sense? And then at the bottom, where you have presidential and parliamentary, in between those, put down branches divided. And what I mean by that is, how do they divide their branches? So if you get a question dealing with branches, you know right now it can only be one of two, which is either presidential or parliamentary. And again, all this will make sense once we go through it. All right? So let's start in the middle there, because that's just kind of how our definite. Well, let me make sure before I go real deep into this. Okay, so, and this is what we just told you. It says democracies and dictatorships are classified according to who can participate. So who is in the power? That's where those two fall in. It says unitary, federal, and confederation style governments are classified based on how power is divided. Is it a national government has all the power? Is it divided between a national and a state government? Is it divided between a national, state, and a local government? Like, that's how those work. Y'all with me? And then a presidential and a parliamentary government are defined by the relationship between the executive and the legislative branch. Are they separated? Are they in the same, are they together? How do they work? All right, so that's the idea behind this. Just out of curiosity, if I were to say, guys, in the top, who run in the United States, what do we have? A democracy or a dictatorship? You guys would tell me what? We would have a democracy. If I made you look at the middle one, and you don't even have to know the definition of how power is divided, do we have a unitary, a federal, or a confederate type government? You've always heard it called the federal government, right? So we have a federal one. And then common sense would tell you at the bottom, are we a presidential or parliamentary type system?
Presidential.
We have a president, so, you know, by the process of elimination, we could probably figure out that we're presidential, right? So, we just need to know how all this falls in line. All right? So, with that being said, let's start with the word democracy. Okay, now we talked a little bit about this the other day. Underneath democracy, the very first thing we're going to jot down is who is in charge. We got to know the who aspect of this. In a democracy, I don't care if it's either form of it, who runs things? We live in a democracy. Who runs things in our democracy?
We do.
Who's we? The people. So, the first thing we're going to jot down is the people rule. Thanks, Coach, for doing that.
Yep.
The people rule. That's simple enough, right? A fourth grader could understand that concept. Now, you all have to know the two types of democracies. Now, the first one we have here, it says direct democracy. It says in a direct or pure democracy. So underneath where you wrote down the people rule, write down the number 1 and write the word direct. If I could spell it, it'd be even better. Direct democracy. Now, if you look at those notes, it says within a direct democracy, people pass laws by discussing and voting on them in meetings, such as town meetings. This system works only in small communities. So let's basically get an idea of what a direct democracy is, and then we'll explain it. So beside of the word direct, put down that the people rule themselves. People rule themselves. And you may want to jot down that there are no elections. The people rule themselves. Now, what I mean by that is this. There is no type of election. There's no mayors. There's no governors. There's no none of that. The people simply make the rules and the laws themselves, and they follow it. Now, would that type of democracy work somewhere, say, like Carroll County, where 30,000 people live?
No.
Not a chance. You think we're going to get 30,000 people to show up at a town meeting?
No.
Ain't no chance, right? This wouldn't even work in somewhere like Galax. This wouldn't work in Freeze, where there's, 1,000 people maybe lives? Because not everybody would be at these meetings to make decisions. We're talking small, like less than 500 people living somewhere. You don't really see a lot of direct democracies anymore. But a direct democracy is when people rule themselves. There's no type of election going on here. Okay? Simple enough? Does that one make sense? All right, the second type of democracy, you guessed it, is called an indirect. So jot you down to number 2 there and write down an indirect. Now, if a direct is when people rule themselves and there's no elections, what do you think happens in a indirect democracy? People do what? What's that word right there? We elect. It says agents. Those agents are delegates, representatives, governors, senators, things of that nature, who make and carry out the laws. So simply put, beside a indirect, I would put down is people elect office holders. Now, we're electing these office holders to do what? To run what for us? To run the government. We elect them to do it, so we don't have to. Y'all with me there? Does that make sense, I hope? Now, again, I know you already know this, but of the 2 types of democracies we have there, which one do we have in the U.S.? An indirect. Put a star beside of it. So far, so simple? All right, flip it back over on the front real fast. with that box that you have where it says sovereign power is held by, in number 1, who has sovereign power? Who has absolute control in a democracy? The people. So beside the number 1, simply write the people. Now above democracy, what 2 words do we need to write down? Direct and indirect. So far, so simple. All right. Moving on. Let's move over to a dictatorship. Again, we've already jotted this down on the front, so I'll be pretty quick about it. On the back here, where you're writing these definitions down, underneath dictatorship, instead of writing a definition, let's just write down those 2 words and define them, because that's what the definition is. So you've got 2 types of it. The first one being autocracy. It's written in red on the board. And in an autocracy, who runs things? One person or small group? One person. So one person rules. Okay? The second type of dictatorship was the oligarchy. And that's when a small group rules. Which one of those do we have in the U.S.?
None.
Oh, good. We don't have one of these, do we? Titus, you was about to say oligarchy, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
All right, is everybody cool on who has the power? Every form of government that we're going to discuss falls into one of these 2 categories. You guys with me? It's just who has it. Y'all got it? Okay. Flip back over to the box, and let's finish number 3, 4, 5, and 6, and then we'll move on with the other stuff. So let's just stay underneath the word democracy right now. It says those who rule are responsible to blank. So in number 3, basically saying in a democracy, the people that are in charge are responsible to who? If something were to go bad or good, who are they responsible to? Us, which is who? The people. Yeah, so number 3 is the same as number 1. The people. And then number 5 says power is gained by blank in a democracy. Well, we know one way. In an indirect democracy, it is gained how? We go and cast a what? Vote. So that you get it through elections. We get it through elections. All right, let's jump over here underneath a dictatorship. Look at number 4. It says those who rule are responsible to who in a dictatorship? No one. No one. They are responsible to themselves. Okay? And then power is gained how? How did Hitler gain power? Just took it, didn't he? Yeah, he overthrew a government. So I think the best word to use there is by force in number 6. It's by force. All right, is everybody with me on that aspect of it? All right, Now, let's go down and flip back over and talk about how power is divided. So we're going to talk about a unitary, a federal, and a confederate form of government. So, guys, here's the best way for me to explain this to you. When it comes to these three, we're talking about the levels of government. And what I mean by levels is think of it like a stair step. At the top stair step, you have the biggest government there is, a central government. You got me? And then in the middle, you're going to have some type of either a state or region type government. And then at the very bottom, like a locality. You guys with me? This one deals with levels. When we're talking about a presidential or parliamentary, it's talking about branches. So when I'm referring to central, state, or local governments, those are levels. You guys with me? But if I'm talking about executive, legislative, or judicial, those deal with branches. So please keep that in your brain separated. For whatever reason, kids in the past have had trouble with that. Okay? So, that being said, let's talk about how the power is divided. And we're going to start with a unitary form of government. Now, first thing I want you to notice is the picture. Y'all see the picture here? Where it says a central and then it's pushing a button or pushing the arrow down to where it says local. It says power resides with a central government. Local government is secondary. All right, let's back this up. You guys take math. Y'all have had math before. What's the prefix una mean in math? One. Singular, right? So in a unitary form of government, how many levels of government do you think has the power? One. And that would be the biggest one, okay? So if you notice, it says, in a unitary model, all power belongs to the central government. So under unitary, put down all power. We're going to change the wording up just a little bit. All power belongs to one, emphasis on the word one, central government. All power belongs to one central government. Now, continuing with that, it says that they may grant some powers to local governments. Does it say that they have to grant powers to local government? No, it simply says may. Put that down, that they may, and I'd underline the word may grant powers. And I would use the word lower government instead of local. That way you know it's beneath them. May grant powers to lower governments. All right. It says the powers of the central government may be limited or unlimited. We don't need to jot that part down because that's with everybody. Most central forms of government have limited and unlimited power. But then the bottom one we do. It says most governments in the world are unitary in form, meaning there is a central agency. There's one big one, and then depending on what they do with their power makes them separate. So unitary is one of the more popular ones. Do we have a unitary form of government in the United States? No. Because the reason we don't have one of these is very simple. It says that they may grant power. Our federal government they have to give the states some power. You guys understand that? They have to. So the may part is what throws it out. But you do have a unitary form of government. And we'll get into examples of these probably tomorrow, just to make it make more sense. But right now, that's all I need you to remember for unitary. One central government that may grant powers to lower governments. Is everybody with me there? So how do they divide power? How does a unitary government divide power? It really don't unless it wants to, right? It really don't unless it wants to. So far, so good? All right, let's look at our next one. Federal model. Now, if you remember this picture, it has central and an arrow pointing down to a local one when it came to unitary, right? Look at the picture now when it comes to federal. What's the arrows doing? Almost makes them look like they're what? Side by side makes you think equality, right? Now, obviously, that's not the case most times in a federal form of government, but when you get through this definition, it'll make more sense. It says, in a federal model, power is what? Divided between a central and local governments, usually according to a constitution. So very simply put, but under federal, I would put down power is divided. Between a national or federal, or a federal government. Between a national government and local governments. Now, you've already told me that in the U.S. you've heard federal government being said before, so do you all think we have a federal government in America? Yes, we do. But we divide power between the national and the state government. Now, guys, is that power divided equally? Does the state of Virginia have as much power as the federal government does? Not a chance, right? For example, which level of government gets to print money? Yeah, if I pulled out $1 out of my pocket, it looks just like $1 you would have in your pocket. Just like $1 somebody in California would have, right? So that makes me know that the federal government prints money. Is the state of Virginia allowed to print money? No. No. We used to when we were under the Articles of Confederation, but not now. That is a federal government power. Now, guys, can the federal government do everything we need them to do? No. How many of you got a driver's license? At that driver's license, does it say the United States or does it say Virginia? It says Virginia on it. That card allows you to be able to drive in any other state, right? Because you met the requirements in Virginia. Just like someone from North Carolina could drive here if they wanted to, right? But the federal government didn't issue you that. The state did, right? So that's what they mean by dividing power. You guys understand that? So underneath it, just simply put down an example of a federal government. Put the good old U.S. of A here, because we have a federal form.
What is that? It looks like it says BLT.
Between. No, he just abbreviated.
Do what?
Well, he ain't got enough room up there. That's why he's doing that.
It's alright.
Well, Coach is working today. Yeah. You'll learn how to do that in college because you won't be able to get it all down if you don't. So, does everybody see the difference between a unitary and a federal, how that works? Unitary has a central government that may give power out. Federal government also has a central government, but it has to give power out. They divide it, okay? All right, and then the last one we have here is one you don't see very much at all anymore. It's called a Confederate government. Now, if you notice, same type of picture we had under unitary, but the words are separated. It's not a central government on top. Who's on top here? The smaller type government. And then it's got an arrow pointing down to the central. It says most power belongs to a local government, and the central power has only limited ones. So, underneath a confederate, if you guys see, it says a confederation is an alliance of independent governments. So put down an alliance of governments. Alliance of governments. Okay? It says usually involving defense or foreign affairs and to a central government. And then it's talking about the European Union. I'm not concerned about that. You got an alliance of governments, and then underneath that put down the lower governments have more power. Lower government has more power than a central government. Can anybody in here give me an example of a country? And they don't necessarily have to have this type of government present day, but there is a country that had a government just like this in the 1700s, where they gave all the power to the states and left the central government very weak. Y'all know?
You're saying a state? Like, what are you asking for?
Give me an example of a country that had a Confederate type of government.
We did.
Who's we?
USA.
It was, but we weren't considered the USA at that point in time. We
13
were, yeah.
colonies.
So the example of this would be the 13 colonies, the independent states. Okay. Is everybody good with those three? So if I ask you how power is divided, in your brain it should automatically go to, okay, that has to be a unitary, a federal, or a confederate form of government. Does that make sense? All right. And then lastly, we've got the presidential and parliamentary forms of government. Now, when we're talking about these guys, you need to be thinking of the word branches, because these questions are going to be asking you about the executive and the legislative branches and how they operate with one another. Okay? So, in a presidential form of government, it says that the government divides, emphasis on the word divides, executive and legislative power. So what are we doing to the branches? What are we doing to the branches in a presidential style government? They are what?
We got three of them.
Divided, right?
Yeah.
So underneath presidential, put that the executive, and you can abbreviate these if you want to. I do EXE. The executive and legislative, LEG, are divided. Meaning on one side you have the executive, on the other side you have the legislative. They are separate. You guys got that? They are separated. And then they divide power. So in a presidential form of government, the branches are what? Are they divided or are they together? They are divided. They are separate. Okay? They are separate. Now, just to give you, so this makes sense, in a parliamentary government, if you notice right here, it says the legislative chooses the executive. So are they separate here? They are not. The legislative is actually bigger than the executive. And I'll give you an example of these together here in a second. So underneath parliamentary, we're going to write down that the legislative chooses. I would underline the word chooses. The executive branch. Okay? Now, let's make this as simple as possible. Let's go back over to presidential. The executive and the legislative are divided. I know that because here's how. Who's in our executive branch within the United States? The president, right? Who's in the legislative branch in the United States? Congress. They work together, but are they separated from one another? Yeah. They got certain checks and balances that they compete with, but as far as being, they're separate entities. They work away from one another. You guys understand that? Mm-hmm. So an example of a presidential, put down that that's the USA. Now, underneath the parliamentary, where the legislative branch chooses the executive, an example of that would be England. In England, the legislative branch is called Parliament, hence the word parliamentary. You guys understand that? in Parliament, they have two houses, just like we do in America. We have, in Congress, we've got the Senate and the House of Representatives, right? In England's Parliament, they have two houses. It's called the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Who is in their executive branch? That would be the Prime Minister. You guys understand that? So what I'm getting at here is Parliament chooses the Prime Minister in a parliamentary form of government. You guys understand that? In America, we elect Congress and we elect the President. They are divided. They're separate. In a parliamentary form, they are together. The legislative is actually larger than the executive. So the legislative chooses the executive. Is everybody with me there? Now, common sense will tell you that we are an indirect democracy here in America with a federal form of government with a presidential style. Y'all got that? All right, flip back over to the front of this paper. At the bottom of it, you've got 7 definitions. And we're going to go through these together because this is how you're going to see them on a test and or a quiz. Okay? These definitions match everything over here. Okay? There is one definition that I didn't give you, which is letter F. And we're going to give it to you amongst all this. But we'll go through them straight down and see how we do. So number 7 says, a government in which a single person holds unlimited power. All right, if we base this on how we just learned these 3 steps, that's asking us a who question, right? Who has the power? Well, in this scenario, it's talking about a single person. So that right there tells me that it's got to be some type of dictatorship. And that would be a what? An autocracy. So number 7 would be letter H. Easy enough? Number 8 says a government in which the executive and legislative branches are separate and co-equal. All right, that one's talking about branches, right? So that should be a dead giveaway that it's talking about a presidential or a parliamentary form of government. So which one of those two had separate but equal branches?
Presidential.
A presidential. So that would be letter D. Y'all see how this is easy if you break it down like that? Number 9, a government in which power is divided between a central government and other local governments. Power is divided, so that's either a unitary, a federal, or a confederate form of government. So which one is power divided in? That is a federal, yes. Which is letter B. Number 10, a government in which a small, usually self-appointed group has the power to rule. Who has the power? Small group sounds like a dictatorship to me, so that would obviously be G. And oligarchy. So far, so simple. All right, number 11. A government in which all power belongs to a central agency. It's talking about how power is divided, and in this scenario, it all belongs to a central agency. Central being one, that'd be unitary. Number 12 just kind of gives you a definition. It says an alliance of independent states. That's a confederacy.
We use governments, but they use states.
Yeah. Number 13, skip it for right now. Drop down to number 14. It says a government in which the members of the executive branch are also members of the legislative and are subject to the legislature's direct control. That is talking about the branches. So that is either a presidential or a parliamentary. Which one shares both those? That would be a parliamentary. So letter E goes to number 14. So with the process of elimination, that means letter F goes in number 13, right? The division of power, where it says a structuring of government so that power is shared by a central and several local governments, out beside of that definition, write the word federalism in parentheses. There's literally an entire chapter that deals with federalism, and I'm not going to get into it today. But just think of division of power is when they separate power between the levels of government. You guys understand that? Does anybody have any questions about that? All right, good deal. Let's pause this.